Welcome to Journey. This is week 18. We're talking about Jeremiah, and he also wrote the book of Lamentations. If you remember, if you've read through Lamentations, let me just real quick to summarize the book. It's a lament, and so it is a book that is primarily one in which Jeremiah is mourning the state of the nation, that they're going to fall, that they're going to go into exile, and he just puts pen to paper and mourns about this reality. And in the third chapter, there's this just few verses in which he celebrates God's faithfulness. In other words, he says, "Your mercies are new every morning." And so, despite their circumstances, despite their situation, despite his mourning, he is stating that God is faithful, that his mercies are new every day. And that's just an encouragement for us that as we begin this week, and we're going to look at his major prophecy in the book of Jeremiah, that regardless of how bad our situation looks, no matter how dire our circumstances, is that God's mercy is available for us every single day. And so there's always hope when we place our trust in the Lord. Now, Jeremiah is maybe one of my personal favorite prophets, just in the sense that I relate to Jeremiah. I really like object lessons, and Jeremiah used object lessons throughout his ministry. Jeremiah was called as a young man, and I was called as a young man. And I love the way that he describes his call into ministry, or he was asked, like I was actually this past weekend. Somebody asked me, "Why do you want to preach?" And this was a question that Jeremiah was asked, and he said, in essence, "I can't not preach." He says, "The word of the Lord is like a fire. And it's like a fire shut up in my bones. I cannot contain it." He's saying, if I don't preach, I can't bear it. I can't handle it. It's like a fire that's shut up in my bones, and I can't contain it. He couldn't not preach. And this is how, just on a personal level, this is how I feel about ministry. It's how I feel about preaching. It's something I just can't not do. This is something that God has placed his call upon my life. One of my favorite images in Jeremiah is going down to the potter's house. Jeremiah in chapter 18, he goes down and he just watches the way a potter shapes and molds the clay into a pot. I'd like to start there. If you would just listen to these verses. "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message." So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. Then the word of the Lord came to me. "O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter does, declares the Lord? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." And so Jeremiah goes to the potter's house, and he watches the potter put clay down on the spinning wheel and begins to shape that pot. And while the potter did, the clay was marred in his hands. In other words, it wasn't taking the shape that he thought it should. And so he mashes the clay back down and then reshapes the pot as he sees fit. And the Lord says, that's what I'm doing with you. Now, this is a great image because for me, it reminds me of how God was keeping his covenant promises to them. You see, the nation of Israel, as we've learned, was a nation that was better than anything else, a rebellious people. They had done their own thing. They had gone their own way. They had worshipped false gods. They had worshipped idols. They'd even made some of their own. And so in so many ways, they were simply a rebellious people. But God had made them a promise that he would bless the world through this nation that he had promised Abraham. And that's significant in that you go to the potter's house and the potter makes pots that would go back into the community to bless the people. And so the image here is that God, much like a potter, is shaping Israel again to be a blessing. Do you see the significance? And so sometimes in our lives, he shapes and reshapes us as seems best for him so that he can work out his covenant plan and purpose in our life. And that's the significance of this image of the potter, shaping the pot as seems best to him in order to keep his covenant promises, to make us a blessing. Now they're still going to go in exile, and we're going to read about this in Jeremiah 29, a passage that we probably are familiar with and is central to the entire book because it identifies the reality of the exile, but it also demonstrates their hope. Jeremiah 29. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother, the court officials and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. So all this is saying here is that this is a letter that Jeremiah sent to those who were exiled. So they're in exile. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city, to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. And here's this verse that often gets taken out of context, because what's God just said there? That you're going to be in exile for 70 years. And while you're there, be a blessing where you're at. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. I just love verse 13. This is God's promise. He says, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. Verse 14, I will be found by you, declares the Lord. So here they are. Jeremiah is writing a letter that they will be in exile for 70 years. 70 years. I'm not sure that I'll be around 70 years from now. And so if you put yourself in those shoes for a minute, you have to think in terms that go beyond yourself, your current situation, your current goals, your current ideas, because this would impact primarily the next generation. And I think that's a challenge for us today, is in what ways are we thinking about the next generation? How our lives, our faith impacts the generation that's coming up behind us. Are we raising a generation that will know and love Jesus? Are we raising a generation that will make a difference in the world as it relates to Christ and His church? Are we paving a way forward for them? Are we discipling our children? Are we praying for each other? We've got to think beyond our current situation, our current generation. And I think this letter to the Israelites forced the Israelites to think that way. And then there's this promise in 11 through 13. God says, I know the plans I have for you, and they are good plans. They are plans that provide a hope and a future. The implication here is that God has them here, and He's taking them somewhere else. He's creating in them, in their current circumstance, He is preparing them for Himself so that the future that He had for them, that they would walk in, that they would be prepared for. So God says, I know how I'm going to work this plan out. Will you trust me to do it? That is another thing that we have to ask ourselves today is, do we trust the Lord to work out His will and His purpose in our lives? Because it's His plan. It's His plan. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. Don't miss the significance of this verse. God says, then you will pray to me, and I will listen to you. The assertion that could be made is that the lifestyle that they were living and the prayers that they were offering did not please God, and they were not heard. And so this transformation that He's going to work out in them through the exile would purify them and would create in them the reality that their prayers would now be heard. And then verse 13, you will seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart. This is the core right here, is whether or not we will be people who seek the Lord with our whole heart. Not with half a heart, or a little bit of our heart, or even most of our heart, but that our hearts would be undivided in seeking out the Lord. And so the call for Jeremiah to the Israelites, and the call for us today is to an increasing degree live with whole hearts, undivided hearts. And in chapter 17, Jeremiah says, the heart is a wicked thing, deceitful, who can understand it? But the promise is that God, and we're going to find this out with Ezekiel, God is transforming our heart so that we can follow him with a whole heart. So maybe the prayer this week is simply, Lord, would you work in me a whole heart? Would you restore in me an undivided heart that seeks you and you alone? That is the message of Jeremiah. God bless you. Have a great week.